Hi. The city where I live in Edinburgh has implemented a number of low traffic neighbourhood policies to try and mitigate air pollution through eradicating traffic or diverting traffic from residential streets to main roads. And you talked a lot about health equity issues, which are obviously hugely important. There's been another equity negative impact of the LTN in Edinburgh in that they did not consult blue badge drivers. They did not consult disabled drivers who are car dependent. There are a number of issues for disabled people, including myself because I'm a blue badge driver with some hip replacements. Many of us can't afford electric cars. For wheelchair users, electric cars aren't accessible because the exit is often on the other side of from the charging point. There are many people with disabilities like autism and other mental health conditions that find crowded, pedestrianised areas very stressful and need to be dropped directly off outside a building with a car. And there are a lot of people with hidden disabilities, particularly mobility impairments, which are not wheelchair users, but walking impairments that range from a huge variety from sore toe or a missing toe to being a paralysed wheelchair user unable to move any limb. Many people are ambulatory wheelchair users that have chronic conditions like mine, which means some days they can walk a little bit, some days they can walk a quarter of a mile, some days they can't walk at all. And there was no provision. There's a lot of streets that were pedestrianised without blue badge holders being consulted. My street, one of them, I've been left in a terrible predicament because access to the garage where my adapted vehicle and blue badge vehicle is kept was blocked, meaning that I have to drive a half a mile diversion in heavy traffic, which can take up to 20 minutes to get from my front door to the entrance at the back of my building to the garage to put the car away. And I suffer from chronic cognitive fatigue following a stroke 3 years ago. So I can't always sit in that much extra traffic on top of doing an essential journey to get medication, access social support, or access food. And the council's kind of left me high and dry because they won't mitigate that, and they refused a blue badge parking space outside my front door. So there are some disbenefits of some very radical pollution mitigation policies, and I just wondered, from the wonderful examples that you're giving of very productive schemes, how you've addressed these sorts of issues, because eco-ableism is another force that runs through all environmental policy right now.
Thank you. And so that question mirrors some of the questions that came up in the app, is sort of about the challenges and the downsides of the superblock or pedestrianization.
First off, thank you very much for sharing your experience. And I think you really voiced many issues that definitely have caused problems when developing these superblocks. And like I mentioned, I would say in my mind, mistakes were made, like people's voices were not heard. I think in the case of superblocks, what people tried to do was essentially not abolish all car access, give people who have special needs specific accesses. So for example, they can drive all the way to their front door or can be driven there. Actually, a neat example in my mind was for another scenario in a superblock where I used to live nearby. They brought some swings, and I'm now blanking on the word in English, but you know this, for children to play when you hop on a swing, but then you travel down and bounce back. Zip line. Zip line, exactly, thank you. They put a traditional zip line, and there was a mother with a special needs child that said, hey, this is amazing. We go there, we see the kids having so much fun. My child cannot participate. So she was very strong, and I think it took a lot of courage and a lot of energy to speak up. And the city went ahead and essentially implemented a second zip line with a special swing that had like this overhead protection. So these children who need this extra layer of protection can participate as well. I wanted to mention another example for the BC Bus, where, for example, there is a service in the city of Barcelona, not just for children, for adults as well, where you can call and volunteers come with e-cargo bikes so that individuals who cannot bike themselves, they can still participate because they hop in the cargo bike, there is a volunteer. So these children can still participate in the experience of busing together in a bike to and back from school. So I think, again, there is creativity needed, but these, like addressing these issues really take a lot of energy on all sides, and we need to make sure that we reach a level to speak to each other, listen to each other, and speak to each other.
Yep.
Well, yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, this is exactly the sort of point that comes up with the environmental justice framing around procedural justice, sort of whose voice counts. And I think within, as you're saying, sort of within the environmental community, we do have a problem of sort of an imaginary of what the future we think should look like, very much being based on a middle class able-bodied person.
Yeah.
So it's clear that there needs to be better consultation on the process. On the flip side, I'd say I don't think that can be an excuse to say the current situation we have is good for disabled people either. You know, this motor normativity that every journey within a city centre needs to be by private vehicle. I think there will be people where that's always required, but you know, the number of road traffic accidents and deaths we have, the difficulties with our current system for those that are visually impaired, it's hardly accessible either. So we are in a challenging situation where certain imaginaries that we have for the future are excluding people, but the current situation is also excluding many people as well.
Okay, we'll take the next one from the app, and this is one you actually upvoted, Doug. So we'll get everyone's input, but any thoughts on having indoor particulate matter standards that are binding as a more equitable solution that removes the burden from individuals? Or would something like this have too many unintended consequences?
So this is the good thing of having an app, is you get to upvote the questions that you want to have a go at answering. So I'd say the indoor air community have already been advocating for this in public spaces. I think it's a bit of an easier situation there, because there is a clear responsibility for someone to be controlling the air of a public space. So, for example, in this building, there will be a facilities manager. I have one concern there, and then I'll perhaps talk about private buildings where I personally don't think it's feasible. Sort of one of the challenges we might have in the public sphere is basically those that are already penalised through living in an area with poor outdoor air quality may be further penalised. You know, you're in a school with poor outdoor air quality and that's influencing your indoor air. Who's then ultimately responsible for improving that indoor space? You know, we have one challenge actually around radon here, where schools have a statutory requirement if they measure radon and see that it's above an action level to mitigate it, which in principle you think fine because it's damaging the health of children. The problem is it costs tens of thousands of pounds, and many schools are currently unable to afford pens and pencils. So, and it's something they'll have to pay out their own pocket. So what do? You bury your head in the sand, you don't measure it, right? So that's clearly one of the challenges that we're going to have in the public sphere. In the private, in a former life, I was a political scientist, and I think, how the hell are you going to monitor and enforce that? A threshold within a private home. Moreover, when there are significant sources of indoor pollution which are generated by the activities we take, again, who is responsible and what is the enforcement mechanism? What I think we should be doing within the private space in terms of regulation is tighter regulation on the products that are installed, whether that is ensuring the cleaning products we put within our home are lower VOC, or the building materials that are used, there is that traceability for what sort of things are emitted, to make sure that baked into the building design are products that are good for indoor air. I've got a million other thoughts on that, so maybe we can talk about that, but I'll pass on to the others. I'm keen to hear what you think.
Maybe one term that came to my mind when hearing of these indoor regulations is renoviction. And I don't know if you've heard of this word, but it's very commonly used in Vancouver, actually, where essentially by upgrading houses to, say, more modern standards that, say, making houses more adapted to climate change, there's a loophole for owners of houses to increase the rent by way more than they would normally be able to do. And so that really means that people who maybe to begin with cannot afford these high-end houses, they now essentially are at risk of being evicted because of the renovation. So therefore, renovation. So I think this is really an unintended consequence that is right there and we need to be aware of when putting such standards forward.
We hear that concept a lot when we speak to people in Camden who live in houses of multiple occupancy, where the local authority has a responsibility for trying to keep landlords in check. We hear from people who have issues with their boiler or with the ventilation or a window that's broken, and they're reluctant to ask the landlord to fix it because they're concerned about that kind of punitive response. So I completely agree with the idea in principle that there should be standards for indoor air pollution in inhabited spaces, but I completely agree with the points around the difficulty of making it work. I suppose one thing that would be more useful perhaps is finding a standard for indoor air quality in a space prior to habitation, or if there were a standardized way of assessing it that discounts the idea that the occupant's own activities create pollution as well. So if we can find a way to have a better way of assessing whether a building, before anyone goes into it, is fit for habitation based upon indoor air quality or damp and mold and sufficient ventilation, I think that could be useful. But how that we could get to that point, I think is challenging.
Thanks very much. Super interesting discussion. I'm curious around the kind of community engagement aspects of the work that you're doing. Oh, sorry. No worries. And particularly the kind of general understanding of the links between air pollution and health. So everyone cares about their health, their children's health, etc. The data that you showed about the impact of air pollution potentially on children's mental health, children's asthma rates, etc., is very striking. Is there general awareness, do you feel, in Camden, of those links? And how is this work, getting people to participate in the actions, having these discussions, and also seeing do they understand the effects of these positive changes? Because it's also, we kind of get used to what we have around us, right? And it's sometimes we don't think to look back and go, actually things are improving. And there's been a huge pushback in Oxford where I live on the LTNs. I rent, and my landlord's furious that it costs more now to call someone out because they have to drive longer and all these things. But there isn't any communication around what the potential benefits are, whether air pollution has gone down where I live. So I was just wondering about that kind of communication and community narrative aspect.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. So the communication, I think, is absolutely fundamental. I think if we don't try to talk to people clearly about why it is we're doing these often controversial projects, then we're not going to get people on board with the idea that they are necessary. But it's also more difficult to get people involved in the co-design in a way that is equitable, so that we avoid, disadvantaging vulnerable groups. I mean, the approach we've taken in Camden is to try to do the hard work of having or building that sense of rapport and trust with the communities, particularly where we think there are parts of the borough, as we've seen, where there are higher rates of asthma that we think is in many ways tied to housing conditions. Trying to work with local organisations that already have that degree of connectedness within a community that's vulnerable, not trying to reinvent the wheel, but finding senses of trust and being open and transparent about what we're trying to do and why. But equally, as I said, not absolving ourselves of responsibility from taking action where we know that as a housing provider or as the local transport authority or the planning authority, we need to make policy changes just because we can do it and it would make sense. Does that answer? Partially.
Do you think the success stories are being told enough as well? Do you think people see the benefit in the communities you talk to?
That was it. I think probably not at the moment. No, that's a really important point. You hit the nail on the head as well about the fact that we've lived with air pollution as a problem for such a long time. And because it is so much better, I think it's hard for people to understand why there is an increased need to do more. And I'm kind of worried in the UK that the fact that so much of our monitoring network is now compliant with the legal limits for air pollution, that it's going to be really difficult for anyone to justify why we need to do more to tackle something when there are so many other problems that as a society we're having to deal with. So yes, we do absolutely need to be really clear with people about what the health benefits are at an individual and a community level from what we've achieved so far, but also if we were to go that bit further and reduce our exposure at home, at school, outdoors and in other spaces, I think that would be hugely advantageous for building that sense of collective understanding about why we need to keep doing stuff.
Just relate to that quickly. Do you have data that you're monitoring on what's been the benefits of that action in terms of the people who haven't got sick, or the people who, the lives that could have been saved, or the children who maybe don't need mental health services, who
Well, we haven't thus far, but we've been really lucky in Camden that the sort of the health and wellbeing department, which is public health in Camden, has now really bought into the idea of, they fully understand that the environmental conditions that people live in are hugely influential on health outcomes. So we have a new project that we're just about to start, which is a much more expansive version of the Sense Alone project that I talked about at the beginning. And it would look to include metrics like that to understand amongst children who already have asthma management plans, if through that process we can give the family an indoor air quality sensor, are we also able to look at their usage of rescue medication and other things that perhaps could indicate whether or not their condition is being better managed as a result of participating in the project? So we're figuring out how we do it, but very much we need to find a way to do that because it then strengthens the case for doing that for in many other places as well.
Okay, quickly.
Yeah, can I just add a quick point on the sort of celebrating the wins? One of the things that I find really empowering is that if you look at the dose response curve for something like PM 2.5, it's not linear. Actually, the reductions you make from going from relatively low to even lower can be as much or more than that huge improvement from, say, going from 50 to 10 micrograms. So these improvements of going from relatively clean to even cleaner are vital.
Okay, last question at the back.
Hi, I'm Elaine Fletcher, editor-in-chief of a nonprofit daily, health and climate. And prior to that, I worked at WHO with Diarmid and Gang on active transport. So I was quite interested in your presentation, Sarah. And I just wondered, though, two questions. One is you talked a lot about Barcelona, but living in Switzerland, there's the Pedibus model in Switzerland,
So
at least in Suisse romande, that is, I think, quite common. I mean, there's a Pedibus sign in my neighborhood where parents gather and then walk their kids to the train or to school. So I'm just wondering, and then I know that in the UK there's been the walk to school. There's been a lot about active transport. Active transport, because the two dilemmas parents have in the morning is getting to work and getting their kids to school. So I just wondered, have you tried mapping other examples of this and looking at how this could be translated from great case studies to more policy mandates or initiatives? I mean, I don't know how you can't really force a parent to walk to school with their kid or to group together with other parents, but at the same time, there may be some kinds of incentives or, just even raising awareness about this kind of group actions. Just wondering what else is done on that.
So I have to confess, I haven't been aware of this bus in Geneva. But the truth is, I just moved back to Switzerland about 10 months ago. So I'm sort of reintegrating in my own country after 20 years abroad. So sorry. When looking up the BC bus, I do feel like, again, there's a lot of momentum, like through small hubs where you have people who are really burning for this idea. Again, I showed the bcbus.eu website where people are really putting forward these apps, these sort of even toolkits that will facilitate setting up these BC buses in different cities or environments. I did not come across very many, say, organized scientific or on a policy level initiatives to really get, say, a stronger handle on this. I feel like it's still just very much community driven. Yeah.
Perfect. I'm sorry, we have to stop it there because the next session starts without a break in exactly 5 minutes. And so I'd just like to thank all our speakers for the really engaging session and the Physiological Society for putting this on. And thank you all for attending as well.